The time of weapons taboo has passed. That's what Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba wrote in a Facebook post this week. He stressed that this year Ukraine will finally receive arms from its allies, which it failed to receive last year. Britain and Poland have confirmed that they will send modern heavy tanks to Ukraine, while the US, Germany and France have also promised armored vehicles for the first time since the war began in February. But Ukraine says it's not enough. Meanwhile, fighting continues in the region of Donbass for the last 4 months. So on To The Point, we ask, tanks for Ukraine. Is the West joining the war? Hello and welcome to The Point. On our panel today, we have Christoph von Marschall. He is senior correspondent at the Berlin-based newspaper Der Tagesspiegel. Jessica Berlin is a political analyst and founder of the strategy consultancy Co-Struck. And joining us from Bonn, we have Roman Goncharenko. He's from Ukraine and works for DW's Russian desk. Thank you for joining us. Christoph, I'd like to start with you. Now, for the last 11 months, we've seen a kind of reluctance on the part of the Western countries to directly get involved in the war. Now that these tanks and armored vehicles are being delivered, is NATO taking a U-turn? Would you say that?
No, I wouldn't think so. NATO countries are just delivering weapons. They are not fighting on the ground. They are not sending troops. So nothing has much changed. Of course, it's a difference whether you just send old Soviet-type weapons or now Western technology. But I think the pressure is growing, and we will see in the next weeks really open debate whether German Leopard heavy fighting tanks should be delivered, and not only by Germany, but through a consortium, a coalition of European countries who are wanting to do that.
Right. Jessica, since the beginning of the war, the Western countries have been talking about this red line that should not be crossed. Do you think the red line is getting crossed now?
Absolutely not. Like Christoph mentioned, sending equipment does not make the West party to a war. If this were the case, then Iran would indeed already be considered a party in this conflict because they have been supplying drones and missiles to Russia. So the logic or the fear that somehow by sending more advanced weaponry to Ukraine, the West is becoming a party in the conflict is simply factually false. Also, it becomes a bit of a moot point because if we look at the equipment that has already been sent by Western nations, including Germany last year, Haubitzen, Leopard, so cheetahs, air defense missiles and vehicles, we already have sent a lot of deadly weaponry amongst the Western nations to Ukraine. So the fact that the caliber and the size and the number of weapons would increase this year does not change that dynamic.
Right. I'd like to go to Roman now in Bonn. Roman, we know that there's heavy battle going on in Bakhmut and Soledar. But now that the Western countries have decided that they are actually going to deliver the tanks and the weapons, do you think the situation can be brought under control, or do you think that the decision was actually taken too late and this should have happened a few months back?
Well, yes, I think the decision is too late, but maybe it is just on time to stabilize the situation. The calls to deliver infantry light vehicles like the German Marder, we heard them in spring, and Germany said no. Although the German industry said yes, we could send dozens of Marder tanks or IFVs to Ukraine very soon. It didn't happen then. So what has changed? I think one of the major reasons could be that Western intelligence now has enough information that Russia is preparing new offensives in Ukraine this year, probably in the coming weeks, maybe in spring. But definitely there's something going on. And just like we've seen, as Western intelligence knew that Russia was preparing to invade and starting to send light weapons to Ukraine, for example, Javelin anti-tank missiles, which were very important in the first weeks to stop the Russian invasion. I think we are seeing something of the kind now when the West knows there will be an attack and it wants to help Ukraine to withstand. And of course, this is not a game changer like, for example, the US rocket system HIMARS was and still is. It's a system that allows Ukraine to strike deep behind the Russian lines, about 80 kilometers. And we've seen how it was used at the beginning or during just on the New Year's Eve. And many Russian soldiers were killed by Makiivka in the region of Donetsk. But that is a game changer. Sending tanks is not a game changer, at least not at this moment. The West has been sending tanks before, but they were Soviet tanks. Now they are Western tanks, and they will help Ukraine stabilize the situation. But sending main battle tanks like the Leopard 2, the German one, there is no decision on that yet in Berlin. That could be something very important. But as I've said, there is no decision on that yet.
Right. Sending these tanks is not a game changer. That's what Roman says. It was about a year back when Germany had provoked outrage by offering to supply 5,000 military helmets to Ukraine. Germany's reluctance to send military equipment had caused a stir. But now things seem to be changing. Is it pressure or is it a change in the strategy? Let's take a quick look at the supplies that Ukraine is expected to receive in the coming months.
It was quite the diplomatic bang when French President Emmanuel Macron announced the delivery of the AMX AC-10 armored vehicle to Ukraine. It might be a discontinued model in France, but it is still valuable for Ukraine with its 105mm gun. The Western allies are under pressure to act. The US is following suit by supplying its Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. It only has a 25mm gun, but its defense missiles can engage enemy tanks up to 4 kilometers away. At the same time, Germany has also promised to deliver 40 Marder infantry fighting vehicles, some from Bundeswehr stocks and some from the private industry. It will take about 8 weeks to give Ukrainian soldiers the required training. Great Britain is going one step further by offering Ukraine the chance to acquire Challenger-type battle tanks. Will supplying Western tanks turn the tide of this war?
Will it turn the tide, Christoph? What do you think? Roman just said that these are not game changers, whereas UK is saying that it actually wants to deliver tanks that will change the game. Do you think the game will get changed?
It starts as dynamics that might change the course of the war. The situation, when it gets to the question whether we get to talks between Russia and Ukraine, Putin made quite clear that he is not willing to stop the war, end the war, until Russia can keep the territory which they occupied. And from the Ukrainian side, it's clear that they don't want to agree to that. So there is the necessity that Ukraine has to reoccupy its territory, and therefore they need these heavy tanks. And for the time being, as we have seen, the Marder, the French tank, the Bradley fighting vehicle, these are not the heavy tanks they need for a ground offensive. And in order to do that, we will get to the discussion that they need these heavy tanks, and the best model for the situation is the German Leopard. All experts agree on that for different reasons. There's enough in stock. There are spare parts, which is not the case for the French battle tank. And the American tanks must be first delivered over the Atlantic to Europe, which is also not quite a very pragmatic way to do things. And most Western armies in Europe use already the Leopard, and there are enough governments willing, and they are just waiting for the German permission, the export permission to do so. And the pressure is building because the Commissioner of the European Union, Ursula von der Leyen, a German politician, took the stage and said she is in favor of sending Leopards to Ukraine. Sweden has now the presidency of the European Union. The government is in favor of doing it. Poland asked to do it. Lithuania and Spain asked already in summer to do it. So it really all concentrates that pressure on the German government. They have to decide whether they give the permission to export this German-made Leopard to Ukraine or not. And I think they can't afford for a very long time not to permit it.
Right. You've talked about Leopard 2 at length. Jessica, I'd like to actually understand the difference between these tanks. I don't mean to get very technical, but we just saw very briefly in the report that about the 4 countries. So what is Germany, what is France, what is US, and what is the UK actually planning to give? And how do we differentiate between the heavier tanks and the lighter ones?
Right.
The game changers and the non-game changers.
The infantry fighting vehicles that have been committed to go to Ukraine are, you could say, light tanks. They have a lighter build and body. They're a bit faster, but they also do not have the amount of armor or also the higher caliber of ammunition that the main battle tanks, the MBTs, have. And the real crucial issue here for the MBTs to arrive, to already get the approvals and be sent now. It's crucial that this happen as soon as possible so that the Ukrainian armed forces are able to receive and train on these vehicles in time to launch their spring counteroffensive. And these vehicles these tanks will not only save lives, they will help the Ukrainian armed forces to liberate more territory and to defend against the assumed pending Russian attacks in the coming weeks and coming months. And it's incredibly important for the European Union, the European allies, and the United States to move quickly now, because for the past year, what we've seen is Western aid being enough to keep the Ukrainians alive, to make sure Ukraine doesn't lose. But now, this year, we must ensure that Ukraine is able to win, and we need to arm them accordingly. This is crucial because time plays to Russia's hand. They have more weapons, they have more manpower. They could drag this conflict out for a very long time if allowed to. Whereas by acting now and by giving the Ukrainian armed forces the tools, the weapons, the support they need to win decisively and to liberate their territory, will deter Russia from any further kind of aggression on this scale. But the more time they get to regroup and to rearm, and the more weakness and hesitation they see on the side of the Western alliance, only serves Russia's interests. Therefore, we, and especially here in Germany, need to pull ourselves together and act now.
And what is stopping Germany then?
That is a question that could fill an entire show unto itself. But at the end of the day, and I take no pleasure in saying this, but from discussions with German politicians from all the major parties, including the SPD, the problem is the Chancellery, is Olaf Scholz and his colleagues in the Kanzleramt, in the German Chancellery. They have been blocking the export approvals, the export requests from our allies for months. And the main argument that they've been using, number one, is, Olaf Scholz loves to repeat, we don't want to go it alone. Keine Alleingänge, in his words.
Right.
And the issue now, however, as Christoph mentioned, there's a lot of pressure building on both sides of the Atlantic for Germany to approve the Leopards to be sent. Now, Germany's...
Not alone, but in a coalition.
Yes,
yeah,
yes, not only alone, but we need to approve the exports for the other countries, and of course we need to contribute our own. But even if we didn't contribute German Leopards, we have been blocking, our government has been blocking the delivery from other countries. But now, by still holding out, that not going it alone, that has been Olaf Scholz's main excuse, is becoming the going it alone. So that excuse has already sort of fallen apart. And the second one, the second fear, I would almost call it, rather than an argument, because it is not based in a technical or even legal reality. I think it's quite frankly, a subjective fear that sits heavily in the staff of the Chancellery and indeed personally with the Chancellor himself. This notion that if Germany sends too many weapons, Russia will consider us a party in the war. And this is, as previously mentioned, just a nonsense argument. That's not how declarations of war work. If this were the case, then Iran would be at war with Ukraine, and they are not.
Yeah,
and in fact, Germany already would be for the weapons we've already sent, or the United States for sending HIMARS. If HIMARS are okay, Why are Leopards not? It is indeed an irrational argument.
But that seems to be a decision that Germany does not want to take alone. And Olaf Scholz has said that we can't take this decision without our transatlantic partners. And I quote, he said specifically, without United States of America. Christoph, who is actually going to take the decision, Germany or the US?
Well, formally, Germany has to take the decision, but they will be pressured by the US. And the argument, which is used by the Chancellery, not going it alone or we don't have a consensus, it is just factually not true. We know that they are allies. And the American government has made it quite clear that Germany is free to take that decision. They haven't yet said officially you have to, because that's also not how diplomacy works. But it is pretty clear that the US and European allies, not all of Europe, but enough European allies, would be in a coalition with us if the Chancellery would decide we want to give Leopards to Ukraine. It would not be a German going it alone. It would be a coalition and probably a transatlantic coalition. And maybe the US government has to make that even more clear publicly in order to convince the Chancellor and also the German public, because as we look at the opinion polls, after the decision that we send the light tanks, there was a majority in favor of it. At the moment, there's a majority against sending Leopards. But if the government would explain why that should be done and that we are in a coalition of countries which are in favor of it, I assume also in this case the public mood would change and would support it.
In fact, the stalling from the Chancellery has been having a negative impact on public opinion. They are sowing the doubt in the public themselves.
And there are about 2,000 Leopards in Europe with different countries. And Ukraine has said that it needs at least 300 tanks. So I'd like to ask Roman there. Roman, do you think that's a demand that could actually be met, 300 tanks?
Well, it's hard to say. It is very important to start. So we've seen that as soon as some kind of equipment is delivered, then the Ukrainians learn very quickly. And then more of that equipment, type of equipment, can be sent. So in the end, maybe by the end of this year, we could end with hundreds of Western tanks, not just Leopards, maybe some other Challengers from the UK, as you've mentioned, could be sent to Ukraine because it needs them urgently. What we haven't mentioned yet, but I think it is very important for us to understand why these things are happening. Why are we talking about Western countries breaking the taboo and finally sending what Ukraine has been asking for a year, like light tanks, heavy tanks, and also anti-air craft system, air defense systems, Patriot, which was also kind of a red line, which has now been crossed, and Berlin is on that ticket. Delivering it or promising to deliver it together with the United States, one battery of Patriot. So Russia is speeding up and increasing its military. Russia, just in December, Russian president announced and his defense minister announced that the Russian army will be increased by 500,000 soldiers. This is already happening. The new year started, and the decree by President Putin is now in force, increasing the Russian army by over 100,000 soldiers, and one more increase is expected. When spring conscription campaign begins, Russians up to 30 years old will be drafted to the army. These people will be sent on the battlefield.
Exactly.
The Russian military is producing, Russian plants are producing tanks day and night. They will be sent to the front. The West had to respond.
Right. So you're talking about what's happening in Russia. Let's take a look there. Soledar, a salt mining town in eastern Ukraine, has seen some intense fighting in the last few months. The town is located about 10 kilometers north of Bakhmut in Ukraine's Donetsk region, and the capture of this region is widely seen as a Kremlin war objective.
The muffled thunder of cannon fire is relentless. In the heavily embattled towns of Bakhmut and Soledar, both sides have spent weeks firing at each other day and night. Russia has been mounting pressure with tactical advances and claiming ground, most recently in Soledar. Bakhmut and Soledar are currently the bloodiest places on the front, according to Ukrainian President Zelensky. Anyone who is able flees, like this woman from Soledar. We survived by hiding in different apartments. When one apartment was destroyed, we moved to the next. When it became unbearable, we fled. I would have liked to leave earlier, but I couldn't. At the same time, Russian and Belarusian army units are training in neighboring Belarus. This is one of the reasons why concern is growing over a new front north of Kiev. But is the Russian army still strong enough for major offenses?
Is it, Christoph? Now, Moscow had claimed in September that it had annexed this region. We are in January right now, and the fighting is still going on.
Well, I have rather dire perspectives on this year. I don't think that the war will end in this year. I think we will see heavy fighting. We might hope that Ukraine is able to re-win territory. But there's also one more aspect which I would like to mention, and that is the question to which degree Europe is an international body on itself, strategically autonomous or not. And we see again in this year that without American help, Europe is not able to stop a war on its continent. So from my perspective, they are not looking bad, but they're also not looking very good at the moment. And there has to be more done in order to get in a better position to end this war rather sooner than later.
Right. And Soledar, Jessica, that is militarily, it's not a very relevant place. Why is Russia so keen on capturing this region?
Well, it's, like you say, it's not about the town specifically, but its geographical location. And if they are able to capture this town, then it opens up Bakhmut and from there further territories within the region. So it is it simply enables them to advance their offensive. But I'd like to come back to what Christoph said. There is indeed the possibility of this war dragging on for a long time if the Ukrainians are not properly equipped by their allies. That is what last year taught us. Do not underestimate Ukraine's ability to quickly absorb and deploy Western technology, Western intelligence, and Western hardware. So this year, the debate we are currently experiencing around the delivery of main battle tanks, we're going to have this debate about aircraft, about fighter jets, and about long-range artillery systems like the American ATACMS. So we need, across the transatlantic alliance, to clearly define what is our goal for this year. What is the battlefield goal? If we in Europe and across NATO want this war to end in 2023, and especially for the Americans, if they want this war to end before the 2024 presidential campaign, which I think they do, then we must act accordingly and arm Ukraine now. This is a sheer tactical reality. And as Roman had mentioned, the Russians, they are pumping on full gas to rearm, re-equip, and reman their army. And they can do this all day and night. So if we do not respond with the same intensity and conviction and speed, then that is what turns this into a long war. But
that's
properly
right.
enabled,
we're
Ukraine
coming to
can
the
win
end
this year.
of the show. Sorry to interrupt you there. I'd like to go back to Roman once before we conclude. Roman, do you think, now Christoph and Jessica, they've both talked about whether the war will come to an end this year or not. How do you see this? Do you think the war will come to an end in 2023?
I don't think the war will end this year. I think most optimistic scenario is next year, so 2 years more of fighting. But I absolutely agree with Jessica. The speed of this war, the tempo, when it ends, how it ends, depends on the will of the Western countries to deliver more and to deliver fast.
And right now, the temperatures in Ukraine, it's like -15 to -20. Do you think the weather's also making a difference? Do you think in the coming days we might see a different situation when the weather becomes a little more mild?
Absolutely. So General Winter is, or at least at this moment on the Russian side, we hear reports about Ukrainian soldiers freezing in the trenches, and this is one of the reasons why they probably lost Soledar. But this fighting is not over, it continues, and the news of Western light tanks and maybe heavy tanks in the near future that could be delivered, this would stabilize the front line. Absolutely, I'm sure of that.
Thank you. The war is not over, and that's also what Polish President Andrzej Duda has said. Allow me to quote. He said, "The war is not ending. Everything indicates that Russia will continue to wage a war of attrition against Ukraine." The Western defense ministers will meet next week to discuss future military aid. Will Germany give in to the pressure? That's a question that remains to be answered. If you are watching us on YouTube, do let us know what you think about it by leaving a comment. We'll see you next week. Thanks for joining.